Picture this: a lonely diner on a windswept highway, the clock ticking toward midnight. A waitress with nothing left to lose slides a hot meal to a stranger, a ragged man with eyes like steel and secrets he won't tell. One small act of kindness, and then all hell breaks loose. The next morning, a military convoy rolls in, guns blazing, not with bullets, but with a truth that'll turn this quiet town upside down. Who is he? Why does he matter? And what's the dark secret tying it all to a plate of food tossed in the trash? This isn't just a story, it's a wildfire waiting to ignite, a tale of grit, heart, and a fight you won't see coming. Stick around for the flame beneath the ashes. You'll never guess where it burns next. Hit that like button if you're ready for the ride, and subscribe now. Don't miss the spark that changes everything. Let's light it up together. The neon sign above Joe's Diner pulsed weakly, its orange glow stuttering across the barren highway, like a lighthouse on its last legs. Inside, the air hung heavy with the acrid sting of burnt grease and the bitter tang of day-old coffee. A stench Amy Walker had worn like a second skin for 2 years. The wind screamed outside, clawing at the splintered windows, sneaking through the cracks to nip at her fingers as she scrubbed the same gouged counter for the 10th time that night. The clock on the wall ticked 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes until closing. Another shift grinding through a life she'd pieced together from scraps since she was 16. Amy didn't do pity. She'd buried that when her mom slipped away to cancer, 12 years old and clinging to a hospital bed where the woman had whispered, "Be good, Amy, even when it hurts. Promise me." 4 years later, her dad walked out, leaving a sagging trailer and a fistful of sweaty bills on the kitchen table. She'd fought since, waitressing at dives, hauling packages, scouring pots, anything to keep from begging. Joe's wasn't a career, it was a trap, its buzzing lights a cruel reminder of dreams she'd stopped chasing. But deep inside, beneath the scars and the calluses, a fire flickered, a stubborn need to do right, to prove the world hadn't beaten her yet. The bell above the door clanged, a jarring note slicing the quiet. Amy glanced up, her rag stalling mid-swipe. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, his coat a shredded rag flapping in the gusts like a battle-torn banner. Dust crusted his boots, his hair a wild snarl of gray and brown. But it was his eyes that pinned her, sharp as steel, hollowed by a weight she couldn't name, yet burning with a quiet, unyielding pride. He moved to the counter with measured steps, not hesitant but deliberate, like a soldier crossing no man's land. His hand dipped into a pocket, pulling out 3 crumpled dollar bills and a scatter of coins, laying them down with a soft clink, $5 even. His voice scraped like gravel over stone. "Something hot. What'll this get me?" Amy's gaze flicked from the money to the menu board behind her. Cheapest item, potato soup, $8. $5 wouldn't touch the diner's gritty coffee, the kind truckers spat back into their cups. But when she looked up, locking eyes with him, something twisted hard in her gut. This wasn't hunger for food alone. It was a man standing on a ledge, reaching for a thread of warmth in a world gone cold. She forced a crooked smile, the one she'd perfected for drunk regulars and stingy tippers. "You're in luck, mister. Tonight's special, hot beef stew, $5 flat." His brow creased, a flash of doubt crossing his face, but he stayed silent. Amy spun to the kitchen hatch, her hand slipping into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed her last $15. Rent was due in 5 days, and this was all she had left to her name. Screw it, she thought, her jaw tightening as she pulled a 10 and tucked it into the order slip. "1 beef stew stat," she barked to the cook. Minutes later, she set a steaming plate before him, tender beef swimming in rich, dark gravy, mashed potatoes golden and glistening, a warm roll still soft from the oven. His eyes widened for a heartbeat, then settled into a mass she couldn't read. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, carrying an edge that pricked at her. "Damn sure," she fired back, leaning on the counter with a defiance that dared him to argue. "Eat up before it's cold." He gave a tight nod, barely perceptible, and picked up the spoon. But before it hit his lips, a roar ripped through the stillness. "What the hell you doing, Amy?" Rick Hudson burst from the kitchen door, a sweating hulk of arrogance, His stained shirt stretched tight over his gut. A greasy grin slashed across his face. His eyes darted to the plate, then to the man, narrowing with naked contempt. "This ain't a damn soup kitchen. Who's footing this bill?" Amy stood tall, her knuckles bleaching white around the rag. "I am," she said, her voice cold and steady as a blade. "My money, not the diner's." Rick's laugh was a dry, ugly bark that echoed off the walls. "Your money? Real cute. I don't run a handout joint for bums." In one swift, vicious lunge, he snatched the plate from the man's hands and flung it into the trash bin by the counter. The crash was a gut punch. Gravy splattered across the linoleum like blood on a battlefield. Porcelain shards skittering, the roll tumbling into the mess. A trucker at the counter coughed into his mug. An old woman by the window flinched, her fork clattering to her plate. Silence choked the room, thick with their cowardice as Amy's blood roared hotter than ever. "You bastard!" she shouted, lunging forward as if she could claw the food back from the garbage, her hands shaking with fury. Rick shoved her hard, his grin widening into something feral. "Want to play saint? Take it somewhere else. You're fired. Get your ass out." His finger stabbed toward the door, his glee dripping like the oil he slung all day. The handful of late-night patrons, two truckers nursing coffees, the old woman hunched over pie, stared, their faces a mix of shock and shame, but not one spoke up. Their stillness hit her harder than Rick's shove, a lead weight sinking into her chest. Amy turned to the man, her mouth opening to apologize, but he was already on his feet. His hand gripped the small butter knife on the counter, knuckles whitening, his jaw twitching as if a storm raged beneath his skin. A soldier's discipline wrestling down raw rage. Then the knife clattered back onto the wood, a sharp final sound that cut the air. He looked at her, not Rick, just her, and spoke, his voice soft but heavy as iron. "Thank you. You did more than you know." Then he turned, his lean frame swallowed by the night as he stepped out. The bell's jangle fading into the wind. Amy stood frozen, her breath jagged, staring at the wreckage in the trash, the stew, the plate, her last shred of patience all ruined. Rick dusted his hands, smug as a cat with a kill. "Back to work, or I guess not, huh? Hit the road, princess." The fire in her chest blazed white hot, her mom's words ringing in her ears. "Be good, even when it hurts." It hurt now, hurt like hell, but she wouldn't bend. "You'll regret this," she hissed, each syllable a dagger aimed at his gut. She grabbed her coat from the hook and stormed out, the bell ringing her exit into the biting cold. The wind hit her like a slap, cutting through her thin jacket as she stumbled down the road. She didn't stop until she reached a weathered bench 3 blocks away, collapsing onto it with a shudder. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the inferno inside, a mix of rage and something deeper, something like grief. Tears burned her cheeks, hot against the icy air, and she didn't fight them. She wasn't crying for the job. She'd lost worse. She was crying for that plate of food, for the man's quiet dignity shredded before her eyes, for a world that stomped on goodness like it was nothing. "Mom was right," she muttered, her voice cracking as the memory of that hospital promise clawed at her. "Goodness is a flame, and it's burning me alive." Her fingers brushed something in her pocket, a small, worn card. She pulled it out, squinting under the dim streetlight. The faded ink stared back. Lieutenant Column Frank Mitchell, USMC, retired. Her pulse jumped, a jolt cutting through the haze. He wasn't just some drifter. He was somebody, or had been. Who the hell was he? And why did she feel like this wasn't the end, but the start of a fight she couldn't yet see? The streetlight buzzed overhead, a faint drone swallowed by the wind's howl, as Amy Walker slumped on the bench, 3 blocks from Joe's diner. Her breath puffed out in white clouds, the cold biting her knuckles, but it was the fire in her chest that kept her trembling. Rick's sneer, the splattered stew, Frank's quiet exit replaying like a broken reel in her skull. She clutched the worn card. Lieutenant Column Frank Mitchell, USMC, retired, its edges biting into her palm like a challenge. Her mind churned, a storm of questions clawing at her. A drifter with eyes like that? A thank you that landed like a fist? Who was he? And why the hell did she give a damn? Amy wasn't soft-hearted. She'd cut that out years ago. Her mom's death at 12, whispering from that hospital bed, "Be good, Amy, even when it hurts," had left a mark. But her dad's exit 4 years later, dumping her with a leaky trailer and a wad of damp bills, had hardened her. She'd survived on grit, reading people like maps, the twitch of a liar's lip, the slump of a broken man. Joe's had shown her plenty, drifters with dead stares, truckers with cheap excuses. Frank wasn't them. His stillness was a wall, his words a lifeline she hadn't meant to toss. That thank you stuck, heavy with something she couldn't shake. She stood, the chill sinking into her bones, and trudged the 3 blocks to her apartment. A cramped box above a pawn shop, its walls groaning like tired lungs, the radiator rattling like it was on its last gasp. She kicked the door shut, flung her coat over a wobbly chair, and sank onto the sagging couch. A stack of bills glared from the coffee table. Rent due in 5 days, electric overdue, a gas shut-off notice in red ink, but she ignored them. Her fingers brushed the card again, and she pulled it out, staring at the faded print. It felt like a live wire in her hand, buzzing with answers she couldn't sleep without. Rent was down to $5 after tonight's stunt, but regret? Not a flicker. She'd have paid double to see Rick squirm. She grabbed her ancient laptop, its hum a groan as it booted up. I couldn't sleep, she'd think later. That card was a splinter under my skin, demanding I dig. The screen flickered alive, and she typed Frank Mitchell USMC into the search bar, her fingers trembling, not from cold, but from a gut itch she knew too well. The Wi-Fi stuttered, results trickling in slow. Old news articles popped up first, grainy shots of a younger Frank in dress blues, medals pinned like stars. Headlines shouting, "Marine hero saves platoon in Fallujah." Lieutenant column honored for valor. Her breath hitched. He'd been a legend, dragging men from a hail of bullets, a name carved in military lore. But the trail went cold after 2010. A clipped mention of a botched mission inquiry, no details, just a shadow, then nothing. He'd vanished, a hero turned ghost. It twisted her stomach, too close to her own fight to fade into nothing. She scrolled to Jake's number, an old delivery pal now scratching out stories for the local paper. He picked up on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. "Amy, it's damn near midnight. What's the deal?" "Need a favor," she said, cutting through the haze. "Frank Mitchell, ex-Marine, Lieutenant Colonel. Something's off. I want the dirt." Jake groaned, rustling on the other end. "Mitchell? Shit, that name rings a bell. Sounds big. Give me a day, but coffee's on you." She muttered a thanks and hung up, her mind racing like a freight train with no brakes. She wasn't sure what she was chasing. Truth, a lifeline, a way to dodge the hole she'd just dug herself into. But sitting still wasn't an option. She'd lost too much to let this slip through her fingers like sand. Across town in a motel room that stank of mildew and broken promises, Frank Mitchell perched on the edge of a stained mattress. The single bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows over peeling wallpaper, but he didn't flinch. His hands rested steady on his knees, eyes fixed on a faded Polaroid. 5 Marines grinning in desert fatigues, sand streaked across their faces. He stood in the center, arms slung around a kid barely 20, all of them alive then. Rodriguez, Teller, Hayes, Jenkins. Now they were ghosts, KIA from a call he'd made in '07. "Hold the flank," he'd barked, buying an extra minute for air support that never came. Jenkins bled out in his arms, eyes wide with trust turning to glass. The brass called him a hero, pinned medals to his chest. But the screams drowned out the applause. He'd quit the Corps after the inquiry. His fault, not theirs. Fleeing the parades. The guilt a weight he couldn't shed. He flipped the photo, tracing the names in his tight scrawl. Rodriguez, Teller, Hayes, Jenkins, then pulled a battered notebook from his pack. In precise, soldierly script, he wrote, "Amy Walker, the last flame." He'd been wandering for years, testing America's underbelly, diners, gas stations, shelters, hunting for a pulse, a shred of decency in a world he'd bled for. Most turned away. In Tulsa, a guy spat in his face, snarled, "Leech!" and he'd nearly broken, ready to let the ghosts win. Then tonight, Amy happened. She didn't just see him. She fought for him, risked her scraps for a stranger's dignity. It wasn't the food. It was the spark, a flicker of good he'd thought snuffed out. He'd called Carter before stepping into Joe's, a late-night murmur into a burner phone. Found one worth it. Move fast. The plan was in motion, but Amy was the wild card, a sharp-edged woman who didn't bend. He tucked the notebook away and leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling, the bulb's buzz a faint echo of chopper blades. "Hang on, kid," he muttered to the empty room, a rare hope curling in his chest. "You just lit the match. I'm not letting it die." Back at her apartment, Amy paced the tight space, the laptop's glow dancing on the walls like a restless spirit. Her reflection in the window stared back, worn, fierce, a woman who'd built herself from nothing, needing no one. Tonight she'd acted on instinct, not reason, and it cost her. $5 left, no job, rent looming like a guillotine. Logic screamed she was a fool, a sucker burned by her own fire. But that flame, the one that defied Rick, that saw Frank, whispered back, "You did right, and it's not over." Her mom's voice cut through, soft from that hospital bed. "Even when it hurts." It hurt now, a deep ache, but it fueled her. Frank's face lingered in her mind. The way he'd gripped that knife, his jaw twitching with a soldier's restraint. The way he'd walked out like a man mid-war, not defeated, but regrouping. She sank onto the couch, pulling a threadbare blanket over her shoulders, the card still clenched in her fist. Sleep tugged at her, but her mind wouldn't quit. This wasn't done. Not with Rick, not with Frank, not with the nagging sense she'd stepped into a fight bigger than Joe's grimy walls. As her eyes drifted shut, a vow flickered through the haze. "I'm not letting this go. Not tonight, not ever." Amy jolted awake, a low growl shuddering through the thin walls of her apartment, yanking her from a dream of shattered plates and steel-gray eyes. She bolted upright on the couch, the threadbare blanket slipping to the floor, her heart slamming against her ribs. The clock blinked 7:12 a.m. 3 hours of restless sleep, her mind tangled in Frank's quiet, "Thank you," and Rick's sneer. The rumble swelled, a deep roar that rattled the window panes, vibrating in her chest like a war drum. She stumbled to the balcony, squinting into the dawn haze. Down the block, a line of black Jeeps and armored Humvees rolled toward Joe's diner, dust kicking up in their wake like a storm front. Her pulse spiked. Something big was breaking, and she'd be damned if she missed it. She grabbed her coat, yanked on her boots, and raced downstairs, the cold morning air slicing her lungs as she sprinted the 3 blocks. By the time she hit the intersection a street away, the convoy had stopped, engines snarling, blocking the road like a steel wall. A crowd gathered, early risers, shopkeepers, gawkers, murmuring and pointing, their voices a buzz of shock. Amy shoved through, her breath ragged, drawn by the itch that had kept her up all night. She didn't know why she was here. Instinct, maybe, or that card still burning in her pocket. But standing still wasn't an option after last night. Inside Joe's, Rick wiped the counter with his usual swagger, smug from firing Amy, like it was a trophy kill. The bell clanged hard, the door slamming against the wall, and Frank Mitchell strode in. No tattered coat, no dust-caked boots. Now he was a Marine in full-dress blues, dark jacket crisp, white trousers sharp, a chest blazing with metals that caught the light like fire. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and unyielding, a predator stepping into a trap he'd baited. Rick's smirk faltered, his rag stalling mid-swipe. "What's this, Halloween?" he quipped, but his voice cracked, a thin thread fraying fast. Before he could recover, a second figure stormed through. Broad-shouldered, gray hair cropped tight, his presence a thunderclap in service greens. Colonel James Carter, insignia gleaming, led 6 Marines, their boots striking the linoleum in perfect deafening sync. The diner fell silent, the handful of breakfast regulars, 2 truckers, an old woman with her pie, clutching their mugs like lifelines, eyes wide. Carter's voice cut the air like a blade. "We're here for Amy Walker. Where is she?" Rick blinked, his brain scrambling. She, I fired her last night. She's gone." Carter's eyes narrowed, icy and unblinking. "We know," he snapped. "Step aside." Frank advanced, closing the gap until Rick could smell the polish on his metals. "Last night," Frank said, his voice low and lethal as a drawn knife, "you threw my meal in the trash like it was nothing. That wasn't just food. It was the last goddamn thread tying me to something worth a damn. You didn't just insult me. You spat on every brother I bled for." Rick's sweat beaded, his hands twitching. "I didn't know who you were, man. How was I supposed to?" Frank cut him off, his jaw tight with a soldier's restraint. "You didn't care. That's the crime." Carter loomed closer, his shadow swallowing Rick whole. "Frank held a ridge alone in Fallujah. Saved me, 42 others, bleeding out waiting for choppers that barely made it. Carter'd been in the next county on alert after Frank's call last night. A rapid strike drilled into his bones. You? You sling grease and kick heroes to the curb. What's your excuse?" Rick's bravado crumbled, his voice a weak whine. "I run a business, not a damn VA." Carter's growl shut him down. "Shut your mouth. You're nothing next to him." He turned to the window, his sharp gaze locking onto Amy in the crowd, her breath caught mid-gasp. "Amy Walker," he barked, voice booming over the murmurs. "Get in here." The crowd parted as she stepped forward, gravel crunching under her boots, every head swiveling to follow. Her pulse hammered. Run or fight, her instinct screamed. But Carter's tone, firm yet not cruel, pulled her through the door. The diner's stale warmth did nothing to calm her racing heart as she faced the wall of uniforms. Frank gave her a faint nod, a flicker of something steadying in his eyes, and it anchored her just enough to lift her chin. Carter sized her up, his stare piercing but not cold. "We heard what went down last night," he said. "More importantly, we heard what you did for Frank." Amy shrugged, her voice steady despite the tremor in her gut. "Just gave him a meal. Didn't think it'd turn into a damn parade." Carter's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "It's not about the meal. It's what it meant. Veterans reclaim. We rebuild lives for guys like Frank. Homes, jobs, hope. We need people with guts and heart to make it work. People like you." Rick snorted, a nervous bark breaking the tension. "You're kidding. She's a waitress, not some—" Carter wheeled on him, voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "She did more for one of ours in 5 minutes than you've done in your sorry life. Pipe down, greaseball." Rick recoiled, his face paling as the room shrank around him, the truckers shifting uncomfortably, the old woman's pie forgotten. Amy's mind reeled. Her mom's voice flared from that hospital bed. "It'll burn you, Amy." But this time, she wanted the heat, craved it. She looked at Frank, searching his face. Those eyes, steady and sure, saw her when no one else had. "You didn't just feed me," he said, quiet but raw. "You reminded me good still exists. That's rare as hell." His words hit like a punch, simple and heavy, sinking into her ribs. She'd acted on gut, not glory, but here they were, turning it into a lifeline. Carter pulled a card from his pocket, handing it to her. The embossed eagle and anchor gleamed under the diner's lights. "Not charity, a job, real stakes. You in?" Her fingers brushed the card, her throat tightening as doubt, fear, and a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years collided. She'd survived her whole life, not saved anyone. Yet here was a fight she could win, a fire she could stoke. "Yeah," she said, her voice slicing the stale air, firm as steel. "I'm in." Carter nodded, a glint of approval flashing in his eyes. "Tomorrow 800, address on the card. Don't be late." He signaled his squad to move out, their boots a retreating thunder. Frank lingered a beat, his gaze locking with hers. "You're more than this shithole," he murmured, low enough for only her to catch. Then he followed, the bell chiming as the door swung shut. Rick exhaled a shaky laugh, rubbing his face. "Well, that was a circus. You think they'll keep you around past lunch, Amy? They'll ditch you. People always do." She turned to him, her eyes cold and unyielding, a slow, dangerous smile curling her lips. "No," she said, voice like ice over a blade. "They won't." She walked out, leaving him with the echo of her words and the stench of his own sweat, the card gripped tight in her hand. Outside, the convoy roared away, dust settling in the morning sun. Amy stood on the sidewalk, the light breaking through clouds, bathing her in gold. For the first time in years, the cage cracked open. She didn't just feel alive. She felt ready. Ready for Rick's regret, ready for Frank's fight, ready for whatever came next. Amy stood on the sidewalk outside Joe's diner, the convoy's roar fading into a distant growl as dust settled in the morning light. The sun clawed through the clouds, casting jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. But she barely registered it. Her fingers tightened around Colonel Carter's card. Veterans Reclaim, 0800 tomorrow. The embossed eagle and anchor pressing into her skin like a seal on a pact. She'd said, "I'm in," without a blink, but now, alone with the wind tugging at her coat, the weight crashed down. What had she just stepped into? And why did Frank's steady nod, his quiet belief in her, feel like both a lifeline and a loaded trigger? Sleep dodged her that night. Her apartment felt like a shrinking cell, the walls creaking, the radiator hissing like a cornered snake. She replayed the morning, Frank in his blues, metals blazing like a warrior's torch, Carter's steely offer slicing through Rick's wine, the diner's silence as she took the card. It should have felt like a win, a rare middle finger to the world that kept kicking her down. But something gnawed at her. Frank's "you did more than you know" echoed, a riddle she couldn't crack. By 6 a.m., she was up, coffee bitter on her tongue, pacing the cramped space until her boots hit the road. She wasn't waiting for answers. She was chasing them. The address led her to a squat brick building on the town's edge, its lot packed with pickups and a few surplus Jeeps, a sign overhead barking, "Veterans Reclaim, no one left behind," in bold, no bullshit letters. She pushed through the door, hit by a wave of noise, phones ringing, voices clashing, the clatter of keyboards. A receptionist with a buzz cut and a marine tattoo peeking from her sleeve glanced up. "Amy Walker?" she said, already knowing. "They're waiting. Down the hall. Third door left." Carter's office was lean and mean. Framed shots of Marines in desert gear lined the walls. A dented helmet sat on a shelf, and a handwritten sign on his desk echoed the front. "No one left behind." He stood as she entered, his handshake a bone crusher. "Glad you showed," he said, nodding to a chair. Frank leaned against the wall back in flannel, his blues traded for something rougher but no less commanding. His eyes met hers. Pride flickered there, a challenge too, and it steadied her enough to sit straight. "Tell me about Veterans Reclaim," Amy said, skipping the pleasantries. She wasn't here to dance. She needed the raw truth. Carter leaned forward, elbows on his desk, voice steady but edged with fire. "It's no charity gig. Don't get that twisted. It's a mission. Too many of ours come home busted. Streets, drugs, their own hands. We've lost more to peace than bullets. We fight that. Housing, jobs, therapy, a damn lifeline. Businesses chip in, grants keep the lights on. But it's people like you, guts and soul, that make it real." Amy nodded, the words sinking in. "And me? What's my play?" Carter's gaze didn't flinch. "Outreach. You bring 'em in, hear 'em out, hook 'em up. Jobs, homes, whatever they need. You've got what Frank saw, heart that doesn't quit. That's the fuel." She glanced at Frank, who gave a small, firm nod, and a spark flared in her gut. This wasn't just survival. It was a purpose she could grip. But before she could answer, Frank stepped up, his voice low and deliberate. "Hold up, Amy. There's more you need to hear." He pulled her aside out of Carter's orbit into a quiet corner. His hand dipped into his pocket, retrieving a scratched silver dog tag, Jenkins' name etched deep, dangling like a ghost. "Died in my arms, 20 years old," he said, his tone heavy with shadows. "My call, held the flank too long, chopper's late. I've carried him ever since." Amy's brow furrowed, unease prickling. "Why tell me this now?" Frank's eyes locked onto hers, unguarded and fierce. Because I didn't stumble into Joe's by chance. I've been walking this country, diners, bars, back roads, testing people. Tulsa, a guy spat in my face, called me a leech. I was done, ready to let the dark win. Then you. I didn't need that meal. I needed you to give it. I called Carter last night, told him to roll in. You're why I'm still here. Her breath caught, a jolt of realization slamming into her like ice water. You set me up, she snapped, anger surging hot and fast. Frank didn't blink. Not to screw you. I had to know who'd see past the dirt, fight when no one else would. You did. Stood up to that bastard Rick when I was nothing to you. That's rare as hell. His voice softened, raw. You gave me a reason to keep breathing. Amy's fists clenched, then eased as she saw it. Not a game, but a plea in his eyes, a man clinging to a shred of light. She wanted to slug him, but Jenkins' tag cooled her rage, shifting it to something sharper. Pride, maybe, that she'd passed his test without knowing it. You could have just asked, she said, her tone biting but thawing. Wouldn't have been the same, he murmured, a faint grin cracking his armor. Deal? Before she could nod, Carter's voice sliced through, low and urgent. There's more. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a near whisper. Rick Hudson, your old boss. He's filthier than you think. Been scamming vets for years, forging signatures, pocketing 50 grand from disability checks. Widows like Jenkins got nothing while he cashed in. We've had him in our sights, but we needed a spark. You were it. Frank's call last night greenlit the bust. Cops hit his place this morning. He's spilling like a busted pipe. The door banged open, a Marine in fatigues bursting in. Sir, confirmed. Hudson's cuffed, singing loud. Amy's jaw dropped, the second twist hitting like a freight train. Wait, what? Carter's face hardened, a grim satisfaction glinting. Your stand at Joe's rattled him. Gave us the window. Bank records, fake contracts. He's cooked. She stared, her pulse racing as it clicked. Frank's test, her defiance, the convoy. It wasn't just about her or him. She'd been bait, and Rick was the rat in the trap. Fury flared. She hated being played, hated her kindness warped into a chess move. You used me, she hissed, rounding on Frank. He held her gaze steady. Not used, chosen. You struck the match. We just fanned the flames. She turned to Carter, who nodded. He's right. This is bigger than one night. You took down a leech preying on our own. Her anger wavered, Jenkins' tag dangling in her mind's eye. This was for him, for Frank, for every vet Rick had robbed. A dark, savage thrill curled in her chest. She'd lit the fire that burned him down. You okay with this? Frank asked, reading her silence. She met his eyes, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Yeah, but next time, I'm in on the play from the jump. He chuckled, dry and real. Deal. Carter clapped her shoulder, his grip like iron. Welcome to Veterans Reclaim, Walker. You're not just helping vets, you're gutting the bastards who bleed 'em dry. Ready to roll? Amy exhaled, the weight shifting to something solid, something she could carry. Hell yes, she said, a fierce grin breaking through. She'd walked in blind, a pawn in their game, but now her eyes were open, wide and blazing. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for blood, for justice, for a fire she'd never let die. Amy Walker stood on the roof of the Veterans Reclaim building, the late afternoon sun bleeding gold and crimson into the horizon. The wind whipped her hair, carrying the faint hum of the town below. But up here, the air felt clean, sharp and free, a stark contrast to the stale chokehold of Joe's diner. In her hand, Jenkins's dog tag dangled, its scratched silver catching the light, a silent weight tying her to Frank's ghosts and her own fire. She traced the name with her thumb, the morning's twists still sinking into her marrow. 2 hours ago, she'd been a stranger walking into this place. Now she was a soldier in a war she'd never seen coming. The door creaked behind her, and Frank stepped out, his flannel shirt rustling in the breeze, the fading light softening the hard lines of his face. He didn't speak, just joined her at the edge, hands shoved in his pockets, staring out at the sprawl of a town she'd once despised. The silence between them was thick, woven with a bond she couldn't name. forged in that diner, tempered by the chaos of the day. Downstairs, the center thrummed with life. Vets shuffled in, their wary eyes meeting warm coffee and counselors, their stories spilling into the air. Amy had spent the day shadowing Carter, her sharp mind cataloging every detail. How to pair a welder with a shop, how to spot the ones who needed silence more than a job lead. It was a whirlwind, grueling, raw, but it lit her up like nothing ever had. "You holding up?" Frank asked, his voice rough but warm, like gravel smoothed by years of wear. Amy glanced at him, a half smile tugging her lips. "Barely. You threw me into the damn deep end." He chuckled, a rare crack in his armor. "You swam, didn't you?" She nodded, the dog tag cool against her skin. "Yeah, but I'm still pissed you didn't give me a heads up on your little test." Frank's gaze dropped to the tag, his eyes clouding with shadows. "Fair point. I owed you that. But it wasn't just for Carter or the program. It was for me." He tapped his chest right over his heart, his voice dipping low. "I've been running on fumes too long. Thought the world was done showing me anything worth a damn. You proved me wrong." His words hit her hard, raw, and unguarded, peeling back her walls. She'd built them high, against her dad's abandonment, her mom's fading plea, the grind that tried to break her. Kindness had been her defiance, a quiet screw you to a world that didn't care. With Frank, it had grown, a lifeline, a tether between two souls who'd fought too long alone. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice steady but thick with feeling. "I did it because it was right, because Mom told me to be good, even when it hurt like hell. You just made it matter." He nodded, a flicker of pride glinting in his eyes. "That's the difference, Amy. Most see right and walk away. You didn't. Takes guts. Takes love." The word landed heavy, not soft or sappy, but fierce, like a blade forged in fire, the kind that cuts through despair and holds fast. It rippled through her, stoking the flame she'd carried since that hospital promise, the one she'd thought would only burn her down. Their quiet broke as Carter's voice crackled through a walkie-talkie on Frank's belt. "Mitchell, Walker, downstairs now. Got a visitor." Frank shot her a look, half grin, half warning, and they headed back inside, boots echoing down the stairs to the lobby. The sight stopped her cold. Rick Hudson stood there, flanked by two staffers, his swagger gone, replaced by a hunched, broken slump. His shoes were scuffed, one sole flapping loose, his shirt wrinkled and sour with stale beer. Despair clung to him like damp rot. His bloodshot eyes darted to Amy, pleading and pathetic. "Amy, please. I'm screwed. Diner's toast. Cops took everything. I'm flat broke. You've got pull here. Help me." Her blood roared, every memory of his cruelty flashing red. His sneer as he tossed Frank's meal, the shove that cost her job, the way he'd mocked her kindness like it was dirt under his heel. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing, voice low and lethal. "You remember what you said? This ain't a charity. You threw away my work, his dignity, and now you crawl here because you've got nothing left." She paused, letting it sink into his trembling frame. "I gave you a chance to see something good, Rick. You spat on it. Sink in your own muck." His mouth opened, a whimper dying on his lips, but Carter cut in, cold as steel. "You heard her. We don't waste air on leeches, especially ones who bled our people dry. Out." The staffers hauled him off, his protest fading into the dusk as he stumbled into nothing. Frank gripped her shoulder, firm and steady. "You didn't need to save him. You needed him to see what he lost." She grinned, wry and fierce. "Felt damn good. Better than punching him." Carter smirked, tossing her a clipboard stacked with files. "Enough theater. Vets are waiting." She took it, the weight grounding her, and dove back into the fray. Moving through the room, her voice calm but sure as she guided a young vet to a mechanic gig, offered a quiet, "You're not alone," to an older one clutching a faded cap. For the first time, she wasn't just scraping by. She was forging something real, something worth the burns. As dusk deepened, Frank found her in a corner, sorting intake forms under a buzzing light. He held out a small marine pin, its eagle globe anchor catching the glow. For you, he said, pressing it into her palm. You're not just serving meals anymore. You're serving hope, Amy. Her eyes glistened, but her jaw stayed firm. You started this, Frank. That night I thought I was saving you, but you pulled me out too. He smiled, full and unguarded, the ghost in his gaze retreating a fraction. Goes both ways, kid. You dragged me from the ashes. Now we're dragging them. He nodded toward the room. A young vet laughed with a counselor. An older one signed up for carpentry. Small winds stacking into a wall, nothing could break. Amy stepped back into the heart of it, pinning the emblem to her jacket among the vets. Some in camo, some in borrowed sweats, all carrying scars she could feel. She faced them, her army now, her voice steady as she called out a name, matched a skill, offered a nod. Love's not soft, she thought, her mom's plea echoing from that hospital bed. It's the steel in their spines the fire I'll stoke. She'd spent years believing kindness was a weakness, a flame that only scorched her. Now she saw it clear. It was strength, a force that healed, fought, lit up the dark. Rick's ruin was proof. Frank's pin was a vow. These vets were her purpose. The sky outside darkened to indigo, stars punching through. But Amy didn't look up. She stayed in the thick of it, the hum of voices wrapping her like a shield. Love doesn't quit, she whispered to herself, the words a blade and a balm, carrying the weight of every vet in the room, of Frank's trust, of her own unbroken will. And neither do I.